She was told she could never be a mother. Then her husband handed her divorce papers and threw her into a blizzard. But the darkest night of her life was about to bring her a family she never saw coming. On the coldest night of the year, Vivian Hale lost her future, her marriage, and nearly her life, all before midnight. What happened next would rewrite everything she thought she knew about love, family, and the kind of man who stops a convoy in a snowstorm for a stranger he has no reason to save. This is her story. Stay until the end, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The doctor's words didn't come all at once. They arrived the way bad news always does, in careful pieces, each one wrapped in clinical softness, as if the packaging might soften the blow of what was inside. Dr. Anita Sharma sat across from Vivian in the consultation room at Mercy General, her hands folded on the desk, her expression trained into something that was trying very hard to be neutral. The fluorescent light above them hummed at a frequency that seemed to bore directly into the center of Vivian's skull. The scarring on the uterine wall is extensive, Dr. Sharma said. Given the severity and the location, natural conception would be— She paused, chose her next word with surgical care. Essentially impossible, and carrying a pregnancy to term would carry significant risks that we would not recommend pursuing. Vivian stared at the framed print on the wall behind the doctor's shoulder, a mountain reflected in still water. Someone had probably chosen it specifically for this room. Essentially impossible, Vivian repeated. I'm sorry, Vivian. The room did not tilt, the floor did not fall away. That was what surprised her most, the complete and ordinary stillness of the world in the moment her world ended. The light still hummed, the hallway outside still echoed with rolling carts and soft-soled shoes. Someone laughed at the nurse's station, the sound cutting clean through the door. She had gone to the appointment alone because Marcus said he had a client meeting. He couldn't reschedule. She had told him she was sure it was nothing. She had told herself the same thing for most of the 40-minute bus ride. She thanked Dr. Sharma in a voice she didn't recognize. She signed paperwork she didn't read. She collected her coat from the hook on the back of the door and walked through the waiting room, past a young couple holding hands, past a mother bouncing a fussy infant against her shoulder, and she pushed through the heavy glass doors into the February air, which hit her face like a closed fist. She sat on the concrete bench outside the hospital for a long time. Long enough that the light changed, long enough that her hands went numb inside her gloves and she didn't notice. Then she pulled out her phone and called Marcus. He picked up on the fourth ring. She could hear background noise, not an office, not a meeting, music, the soft clink of glassware. Viv, he said. Hey, how'd it go? She told him. Not all of it, not right away. She started with the doctor's name, the clinical language, tried to find the words that would frame it properly, that would let them meet this thing together. But she got about halfway through before she heard it, the shift in his voice, not toward her, but away from her. A subtle tightening, like a door beginning to close. So you're saying, he said slowly, that you can't have kids. Not biologically. There are options. Adoption, IVF with a surrogate. Viv. We could look into— Viv. His voice went flat. Come home. She took the bus back across the city. The snow had started by the time she got off at their stop, light and dry, the kind that stings your face and doesn't settle, just skitters along the sidewalk in loose, restless patterns. She pulled her coat tighter and walked the 4 blocks to the apartment building, rode the elevator to the 7th floor, and stood in front of their door for a moment with her key in her hand. She didn't know why she hesitated. She would think about that later. That small pause. That animal instinct that understood something her conscious mind was still refusing to accept. She unlocked the door and went inside. Marcus was sitting at the kitchen table. He was dressed, coat still on, as if he had just come in himself, or as if he was planning to leave. There was an envelope on the table in front of him, cream-colored, thick, the kind that cost something. He had his hands around a glass of water and he was looking at it the way men look at things when they've already decided something and are just waiting for the formality of saying it. Marcus, she started. Sit down, he said, without looking up. She didn't sit. What is that? He looked up then. His face was composed in a way that scared her more than anger would have. Calm, resolved, the face of a man who had been thinking about this for a long time and had finally found his occasion. He was 33 years old and still handsome in the clean-cut, forgettable way he had always been handsome, and she noticed for some reason that he had gotten a haircut recently. She hadn't noticed until now. I called my attorney this morning, he said. The floor still didn't move. She marveled at that. This morning? Before the appointment? Something shifted in his jaw. Vivian. You called your attorney before you even knew what the doctor was going to say. I've known for a while that something was off, he said. The way you've been. The appointments. The way you wouldn't talk about it. He pushed the envelope across the table. I'm sorry. I really am. But I need a family. A real... And I can't... You can't what? Her voice was quiet. She didn't know how it was so quiet. You can't consider adoption? You can't talk to me about this for 5 minutes before you... Don't make this harder than it has to be. Don't make it... She stopped, pressed her fingers against the edge of the table. The wood was cold and solid and completely indifferent. I just came from the hospital, Marcus. I just sat in a doctor's office and found out that I will never... Her voice broke. She hauled it back. And you had already called a lawyer. The apartment is mine, he said. You know that. It's in my name. I'm not trying to be cruel about this, but I need you to understand that you need to find somewhere else to be. Tonight? I think it's better if we don't drag it out. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the line of his jaw and the careful stillness of his hands and the envelope on the table and the glass of water he hadn't drunk. And she understood that she was looking at a stranger, that she had possibly been living with a stranger for years and had confused familiarity for intimacy and comfort for love. How long? She asked. How long have you been planning this? He looked away. That was her answer. She went to the bedroom and packed a bag. She did it mechanically, without thinking too hard about what she chose. Clothes, her laptop, the small tin box where she kept her documents, her grandmother's photograph, the 3 things she would grab in a fire. Her hands were shaking by the time she zipped the duffel. Not from cold, from something that was trying to be grief and kept coming out as fury. She came back to the kitchen. Marcus hadn't moved. You're useless to me, he said. It came out conversationally, almost gently, which was the part that stayed with her long after everything else had blurred. You understand that, right? I need someone who can give me a family. That's not a character flaw. That's just what I need. She walked past him without speaking. She picked up the envelope from the table and dropped it into the trash on her way out. She heard him say something as the door closed, but she didn't catch the words, and she didn't go back. The elevator was slow. She stood in it with her duffel bag over one shoulder and watched the numbers descend and breathe through her nose and told herself, very deliberately, that she would not fall apart in this elevator. She would hold it together until she got somewhere that it made sense to fall apart. The lobby doors opened and the cold came in like it had been waiting for her. It had gotten worse in the hour she'd been upstairs. The light stinging snow had thickened and slowed, coming down now in heavy wet sheets that drove sideways on a wind that seemed to have no single source, just an omnidirectional hostility. The temperature had dropped hard. She could feel it through her coat immediately. Not just cold, but aggressive, mean, the kind of cold that wants something from you. She stood on the sidewalk outside the building with her bag in her shaking hands and thought, where? Her parents lived in Ohio. She had $43 in her account until Friday and a phone at 12% battery. Her closest friend, Denise, lived in Brooklyn, an hour by subway in good conditions. She had 3 colleagues she might call, but calling colleagues on the night your life fell apart required an explanation she did not currently have words for. She started walking. She walked because standing still felt unbearable. She walked because movement created the illusion of intention, of having somewhere to be, of being a person with a plan. She walked 4 blocks to the intersection of Holland and 7th, where there was a bus shelter on the corner with a mostly intact roof and a plastic bench that was already occupied by a man asleep under a flattened cardboard box. She stood outside the shelter for a moment. Then she stepped inside and sat at the far end of the bench and set her bag between her feet. The wind was less inside the shelter, but the temperature was the same, and the cold came up through the plastic seat and radiated off the walls. And she had been out here for maybe 15 minutes, and already her feet were going numb. She curled her toes inside her boots. Not winter boots, she had left in her regular ankle boots, because she hadn't been thinking about snow when she left. She had been thinking about the envelope and her grandmother's photograph and the expression on Marcus's face, and watched the street through the smudged plexiglass and told herself this was temporary. She pulled out her phone. 11% now. She dialed Denise and listened to it ring 5 times and go to voicemail. She stared at the screen for a moment, then opened her text messages, started typing to 2 other people, and stopped both times. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know where to start. She put the phone back in her pocket. The snow was coming down hard enough now that the streetlights had halos, blurring the edges of everything, turning the city into something indistinct and muffled. A cab went past without slowing. A figure in a heavy coat bent against the wind and disappeared. The man at the other end of the bench turned over in his sleep, pulling the cardboard tighter around his shoulders. Vivian pressed her back against the cold wall of the shelter and pulled her knees up, and thought about what the doctor had said about the scarring. She thought about the word impossible. She thought about how long she had been holding on to the idea of a child of her own. Not obsessively, not desperately, but the way you hold a quiet expectation that you've never examined directly, because examining it would mean acknowledging how much it mattered. It had been there her whole adult life, that quiet expectation. A placeholder for a future that now had nothing in it. So became aware, slowly, that she was very cold. Not uncomfortable cold. Not shivering cold, although she was shivering now, had been shivering for a while without fully registering it. This was a different kind of cold. The kind that starts to feel like drowsiness. Like the body beginning to negotiate with itself about how much effort certain things are worth. She should get up. She knew she should get up and find somewhere warm. A diner, a drugstore, anywhere. But her legs felt heavier than they should have, and she was so tired. The kind of tired that comes from the inside rather than from lack of sleep. She thought, I should move. She thought, I'll move in a minute. The snow kept coming. She didn't know how long she sat there before she heard the engines. She heard them before she saw them. A deep, low sound that had nothing in common with ordinary traffic. A sound that carried weight and purpose, and the particular authority of vehicles that were not in the habit of yielding. She turned her head and looked through the plexiglass and saw the lights first. Not headlights, but something more deliberate. A convoy of 4 black SUVs moving through the blizzard in tight formation, occupying the center of the street with the unhurried confidence of things that belong wherever they are. They were slowing. She blinked. Blinked again. She couldn't tell if this was real or if the cold had started doing something to her perception. But the SUVs were stopping, right there at the intersection of Holland and 7th, in the middle of a blizzard, with no traffic signal to stop them and no apparent reason to stop. They were stopping. The lead vehicle pulled to the curb. The others followed. Vivian watched through the smudged plexiglass and thought, distantly, that this was a very strange thing. Then the door of the second vehicle opened, and a man stepped out into the snow. I was tall. She registered that immediately. The kind of tall that has nothing to do with slouch or posture, just an elemental fact. He wore a dark overcoat that the wind immediately tried to take from him, and he didn't reach for it, just let the coat swing open and walked forward with his hands loose at his sides, as if the blizzard was a mild inconvenience at most. Dark hair. Strong jaw. The kind of face that was difficult to read from a distance. Not blank, but controlled. The face of a man who chose, carefully, what to show. I was looking at the bus shelter. He was looking at her. She became aware of other men moving around the vehicles. She counted 4, maybe 5. Big men in dark coats. Their eyes sweeping the street with a professional attention that had nothing casual about it. One of them said something to the tall man. The tall man said something back, brief, without looking away from the shelter. Then he walked toward her. Vivian's first instinct, later, would strike her as telling. Her first instinct was not fear. It was something closer to embarrassment, the idea of being found like this, huddled in a bus shelter in the snow, clearly in some variety of distress, by a man who moved like the world was required to make room for him. She tried to straighten up. She wasn't sure her spine cooperated. He pushed open the shelter door, it scraped against the ice on the ground, and crouched down in front of her in a single fluid motion. Up close, his eyes were very dark and very direct, the kind of eyes that are not in the habit of pretending they don't see things. "Hey," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, quiet. "Look at me." She looked at him. "How long have you been out here?" She opened her mouth. What came out was not a number. What came out was something approximately shaped like a sentence, broken in the middle, her voice doing something she didn't authorize it to do. He didn't recoil from that. He just nodded, once, as if her broken sentence was information he could use. "Can you stand up?" She tried. She got about halfway up before her legs had a different opinion and she began to go sideways. And then his hand was there, large, steady, warm through her coat, and he had her by the arm and she was upright. She stood there in the bus shelter with this stranger's hand on her arm, the snow roaring outside and her whole body shaking now, proper, uncontrolled shaking, and she looked at him and understood, with a clarity that cut right through the cold, that she had absolutely no idea what was happening. "My name is Damien," he said, "and I'm going to take you somewhere warm. Is that all right with you?" She thought about her $43. She thought about her 12% battery. She thought about her husband sitting at the kitchen table with his carefully composed face and his attorney's envelope and his water glass he'd never drunk. "Why?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a moment with those dark, direct eyes, and she had the strange sensation of being seen, not catalogued, not assessed, but actually seen, which was different, which was a thing she hadn't felt in longer than she could calculate. "Because you're freezing," he said. "That's enough reason." She could hear the bodyguards outside the shelter. She could hear one of them on a phone, low and rapid. She could hear the wind and the snow and the engines of the SUVs still running, patient and powerful. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't." She had spent 30 years being careful. She had spent 30 years making reasonable decisions and trusting the right people and building the right life. And she had ended up in a bus shelter in a blizzard with $43 and nowhere to go. She looked at Damien Moretti's face. She looked at the absolute steadiness of his hands. "Okay," she said. He helped her out of the shelter. The cold hit them both, and he angled himself slightly in front of her, blocking the worst of the wind, which she would not think about until much later. One of the bodyguards, enormous, face like a mountain, utterly expressionless, opened the door of the second SUV. As Vivian reached the vehicle, she heard a sound she hadn't expected, a child's voice coming from inside. "Damien, is she okay? Is the lady okay?" And a second voice, older, more guarded. "Who is she?" And then a third, the smallest, almost lost in the noise of the storm. "Is she going to be warm?" Vivian stopped with her hand on the doorframe and looked into the vehicle and saw three faces looking back at her. A small girl with wide eyes and wind-burned cheeks, a boy just crossing into adolescence with his jaw set in studied wariness, and a teenage girl in the back row who had the face of someone who had decided, at some point, that caring about new things was not worth the risk. For the second time that day, the floor failed to fall away. The world remained ordinary and present and humming. But something shifted, something quiet and stubborn and not yet nameable. It shifted. Damien put his hand briefly at the small of her back, not pushing, just indicating, and she climbed into the warmth of the vehicle and the door closed behind her and the convoy began to move, and Vivian sat in the dark leather interior with her wet coat and her duffel bag, and three children she had never met, and a man whose name she had learned 40 seconds ago, and she closed her eyes and let the warmth begin, slowly, to take her back. She didn't know where they were going. She didn't know who any of these people were. She didn't know that the little girl beside her, 6 years old, named Lucy, who had already reached out one small mitten-covered hand and placed it gently on top of Vivian's frozen fingers, was going to call her mom inside of 3 months. She knew nothing, but she was warm, and she was not alone, and somewhere beneath the numbness and the grief and the rubble of the day, something that had been convinced it was finished, something that had been sitting in the cold of that bus shelter long before tonight, felt, faintly, impossibly, the very first suggestion of a pulse. She opened her eyes when Lucy tugged at her hand. "We have hot chocolate at the house," the little girl announced, with the gravity of someone conveying critical intelligence. "Damien makes it with the real powder, not the mix. He says the mix is a crime." Vivian looked at her, 6 years old, round face, dark eyes that were somehow both shy and relentlessly direct. "Is it good?" Vivian asked. Her voice was still rough. Lucy considered this seriously. "It's the best," she said. "Don't tell him I said that because then he'll stop making it." "Why?" "Because he'll think we're spoiled." A pause. "We are a little spoiled." From the front passenger seat, the boy, Caleb, 11 years old, with his arms crossed and his jaw still set, said without turning around, "You don't have to tell her everything." "I'm just being nice," Lucy said. "You're always just being nice." "That's called being a good person, Caleb." The boy made a sound that was not quite a word and turned his face back toward the window. In the back row, Isla said nothing. She was 15, with the closed-off quality of someone who has learned that open things get broken. She was looking out her own window at the snow and her reflection in the glass, and she didn't look at Vivian, not directly, but once, just once. Her eyes moved in the reflection, and caught Vivian's and held them for half a second before sliding away. Damien was in the front passenger seat. He had not looked back again. He was saying something low and short to the driver, and the driver nodded once, and the convoy turned north. Vivian watched the city move past the window. She watched the snow carve the familiar streets into something strange and quiet, and she held Lucy's small hand, and she thought about nothing, and everything, and nothing again. And then the buildings began to change, grew larger, more set back from the road, the lots wider, the gates more deliberate, and the convoy slowed and turned through a set of iron gates that swung open at their approach. And she saw the house. House was the wrong word. It was the first wrong word of many she would think in the weeks ahead. It was a fortress made to look like a home, a vast stone structure set behind manicured grounds that the snow was currently doing its best to erase, every wing and extension of it lit from within, so that it glowed against the blizzard like something out of a dream that you weren't sure was good or bad yet. Security cameras on every corner. 2 men visible at the front entrance, big and still the way trained men are still. Iron fencing that went all the way around, disappearing into the dark. Lucy was already unclipping her seatbelt. "We're home," she announced, as if this required announcing. "I see that," Vivian said. The car stopped. The doors opened. The cold came in again briefly, before they were moving toward the entrance, Damien's bodyguards forming a loose perimeter that seemed almost casual until you looked at their hands. Vivian walked beside Lucy, who had taken her hand again with the easy confidence of a child who has never been told no about things that matter. The front door opened before they reached it. Inside was warm. Not just temperature warm, but somehow quality warm, the kind of warmth that a place accumulates from being lived in by people who needed it. The marble floors were cold-looking, but the hallway beyond was full of things that told a different story. Children's artwork framed on one wall, a pair of small rain boots left at an angle near the coat rack, a dog-eared paperback face down on the hall table. Someone had left a bowl of unfinished cereal near the staircase and nobody had moved it yet. "You need dry clothes and something hot," Damien said. He was standing behind her. She hadn't heard him come inside. She turned. Up close, in the light, he was older than she'd first assessed, mid to late 30s, with the kind of face that carries its years in the texture rather than the surface. Crow's feet just beginning at the corners of those dark eyes, a scar along the jaw she hadn't noticed before. Not small, white and healed, but significant, the kind that invites questions and discourages them at the same time. "I'm okay," she started. "You're not," he said. Not unkindly, just as a fact that had been established. Lucy tugged her sleeve. "Your lips were turning blue in the car." They were not. "They kind of were," Caleb said from the foot of the stairs. He was watching her with an expression that was working hard to be neutral, but had too much curiosity in it for that to succeed. "There's a guest room on the second floor," Damien said. "Dry clothes will be outside the door in 10 minutes. I want you to take a hot shower, change, and come down when you're ready. No rush." She looked at him. "You just pulled a stranger out of a bus shelter and invited her into your home." "Yes." "That's not something most people do." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She waited for more. He didn't offer more. He just looked at her with those eyes that were used to being direct without giving anything away. And she understood that this was the thing about him, that he was perfectly comfortable with silence, that he had probably been comfortable with silence for a long time, and that he would not explain himself further because explanation wasn't something he owed her, and they both knew it. "Okay," she said, for the second time that night. She followed a woman named Greta, compact, efficient, silver-haired, the kind of person who seems to have been managing things for a very long time, up the staircase and down a hallway to a guest room that was bigger than the bedroom she'd shared with Marcus, and furnished with the kind of understatement that comes from having enough money not to need to prove it. White sheets. A window that looked out over snow-covered grounds. A bathroom with a rainfall shower and a heated floor. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment before the shower. She sat very still and breathed and let the warmth of the room work on her face and hands. She could feel her fingers again. She could feel the cold retreating from her bones the way a wave retreats from the shore, slowly, leaving everything wet and reconfigured. She thought about Marcus at the kitchen table. She thought about this doctor's voice. Essentially impossible. She thought about the word useless, which had been delivered in a conversational tone, which was the thing that would take the longest to stop hearing. Then she got up and turned on the shower. Under the hot water, she cried for the first time. Not dramatically. There was nothing cinematic about it, No collapsing against the tile, no gasping, just water on her face and tears moving through it, indistinguishable from the shower except that they were warmer, and she stood there and let it happen because she was alone and she was warm, and those were the two conditions required. She stopped when she was done and she turned off the water and she looked at herself in the fogged mirror, the pale, blurred shape of herself, edgeless and indistinct. And she said out loud to no one, "Okay, okay." It wasn't a solution. It wasn't even close to a plan. But it was a word, and she was the one saying it, and for now that was enough. Clean clothes were waiting outside the door as promised. A heavy soft sweater, oversized sweatpants, thick socks. No note. She put them on and they smelled like laundry detergent and something faintly woody. And she stood in the hallway and felt, briefly and strangely, like a person who had a place to stand. She found her way back downstairs by following the sound of children. The kitchen was enormous and warm and in a state of benign chaos. Lucy on the counter with her legs dangling, Caleb at the kitchen table with a textbook he was not reading, Isla in the doorway eating an apple in slow, deliberate bites. Damien was at the stove with his back to the room, and Vivian stood at the entrance and watched him stir something in a pot with the focused attention of a man who takes small tasks seriously, and she felt the strangeness of the scene work its way into her chest like something she didn't have a category for yet. "She's here," Lucy announced unnecessarily. Damien looked over his shoulder. "Sit down, it's almost ready." She sat at the kitchen table across from Caleb, who looked up from his textbook, assessed her, and looked back down. It was the same assessment she'd seen at the bus shelter. Not unfriendly, but not warm. Guarded. The look of a child who has learned that new people sometimes go away, and that the management of that possibility begins with not caring about them too quickly. She understood that look completely. "What are you studying?" she asked. He glanced up. "History." "What period?" A slight pause. "American Civil War." "Which aspect?" He looked at her more directly now, recalibrating. "Supply lines and logistics. It's more interesting than it sounds." "It sounds interesting," she said, and meant it. Caleb studied her face for a moment with the thoroughness of someone who is calibrating whether to believe a thing. Then he said, "Most people think it's just about battles." "Most people are wrong about most things," she said. Something moved in his expression. Not a smile, not quite. But the door, very slightly, creaked. Lucy handed her a mug and she looked down and it was hot chocolate. Real powder, not the mix. She looked up at Lucy, who was watching her with enormous expectation. Vivian took a sip. "Well?" Lucy demanded. "It's the best hot chocolate I've ever had." Lucy turned immediately to Damien. "She said it's the best." "I heard her," Damien said without turning around. "I told you," Lucy said, to no one in particular. "I always tell you." Vivian wrapped both hands around the mug and let the warmth move up through her palms and into her arms. Across the kitchen, Isla had come a step further into the room and was leaning against the wall, still eating her apple, still carefully not looking at anything. But she hadn't left. In a teenager's economy of effort, Vivian would come to understand this was nearly a declaration. Damien brought 2 bowls to the table, soup, dark and rich, and set one in front of Vivian and one at the place beside her, and then pulled out the chair and sat down. He didn't say anything about eating, didn't make it a thing, just picked up his spoon. She picked up hers. They ate in the particular kind of quiet that is not the absence of things to say, but the presence of too many, and the shared understanding that none of them are ready yet. Lucy talked. She talked about her day and her teacher, and a specific injustice that had been visited upon her at recess that she was clearly not over. Caleb corrected 2 of her facts, and she ignored him. Isla came fully into the kitchen at some point and poured herself a glass of water and sat on the counter, and at some point she stopped eating the apple and just sat there, arms crossed, watching the room with those careful eyes. Vivian ate the soup. She drank the hot chocolate. She listened to Lucy's voice and the ordinary sound of a kitchen in the evening, and the snow against the windows. And she thought, "I don't know how I got here." And she thought, "I don't know where here is." And she thought, last, quietest, most frightening. Whatever this is, I don't want to leave it. She didn't examine that thought. Not tonight. Tonight was too big and too broken for examination. She just let it be there, small and warm, like an ember that no one had quite extinguished. Later, much later, after Lucy had been carried upstairs half asleep with her arms around Damien's neck, After Caleb had said a brief and formal good night that meant nothing and everything, after Isla had disappeared without a word, Vivian stood at the window of the guest room and looked out at the snow. It was still coming down. The grounds below were white and hushed, and the iron fence had disappeared, and the city beyond had disappeared, and there was just the house and the snow and the dark, and somewhere below her a light was on, and she could see the faint shadow of a man standing at a window on the floor below, not moving, just looking out. Damien. She watched him for a moment without knowing why. There was something about his stillness that she recognized. Not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of a person who has learned to be very quiet around themselves because the alternative is worse. She understood that too. She turned from the window and lay down on the white bed in the borrowed clothes and pulled the covers up to her chin and stared at the ceiling. She had $43. She had nowhere to go. She had a phone on a nightstand that still had Denise's missed call, unreturned, and Marcus's name in her recent contacts, and a voicemail from Dr. Sharma's office that she had not listened to and was not ready to listen to. She had lost, today, the future she had spent 30 years assuming she was moving toward. And she was lying in a strange bed in a stranger's house, in borrowed clothes that smelled like someone else's laundry, listening to the snow against the windows, and she should have been terrified. But the children were upstairs. She could hear through the floor the faint movement of them settling. A door. A voice. Then quiet. And in the quiet, against all reason, she slept. She did not dream about Marcus. She did not dream about the doctor's office, or the bus shelter, or the cold. She dreamed about a kitchen, and a small girl's voice saying, "She's going to be warm." She was still half inside that dream, its warmth, its sense of being somewhere that expected her, when she heard the sound. It came from down the hall. First, she thought it was part of the dream, or the house settling, or the wind. Then it happened again, and she recognized it. A child, awake and crying trying very hard not to be heard. She lay still for a moment. It wasn't her house. They weren't her children. She had been here for less than 6 hours, and she owed nothing and was owed nothing, and the reasonable thing was to lie still and let whatever adult was responsible for this house and these children handle whatever this was. She pushed back the covers and stood up. She went into the hallway in her borrowed socks and followed the sound to the last door on the left, which was slightly ajar, light coming through the crack. She pushed the door open slowly and looked in. Isla, sitting on the floor with her back against the bed, knees pulled up, face tipped down, not crying audibly anymore. She must have heard the door, but her shoulders were moving with the effort of stopping, the hitching, silent kind of grief that is worse than the loud kind because it's learned to be ashamed of itself. Vivian stood in the doorway. Isla looked up. Her face went immediately into something harder and more controlled, a mask dropping down over the rawness. "What are you doing in here?" "I heard something." "I'm fine." "I know," Vivian said. And then, because she had been 30 years old today, and had learned, today, that most of the polite things people say are just shapes that hold nothing, she said, "I'm not going to pretend I didn't hear it." Isla stared at her. The mask held, but only just. Underneath it, barely visible, was the face of someone very young who had been pretending for a very long time. "You don't know me," Isla said. "No," Vivian agreed, "so you should just—" Her voice broke slightly, against her will. She reset it. "You should just go back." Vivian didn't move. She stood in the doorway and said nothing, and she did not leave, and she did not come further in, and she did not offer the kind of comfort that asks something in return. She just stood there, and after a long moment, Isla pulled her knees tighter to her chest and looked down at the floor, and the silence between them was not empty. "She died 4 years ago," Isla said, to the floor. "Today's the day." Vivian said nothing. "He always makes it a regular day. He says she would have wanted that." Isla's voice was flat and precise and working very hard. "Caleb believes him. Lucy's too little to understand." A pause. "I think it's worse when it's just a regular day." "I think so too," Vivian said. Isla looked up, startled. She had not expected agreement. She had expected the careful, slightly desperate adult pivot toward hope and perspective and things getting better. "It's worse," Vivian said, "because a regular day means the world doesn't know. And you can't explain why you feel the way you feel because from the outside there's nothing to point to. You're just a person in pain on a Tuesday." Isla said nothing for a long time. "Yeah," she said finally, very quietly. "Yeah." Vivian stayed. She didn't go into the room. She stayed in the doorway, her shoulder against the frame, and they didn't speak much. And what they did say was small and ordinary and beside the point. And eventually Isla stopped shaking and her breathing evened out and she looked less like someone fighting her own body. At some point, Vivian heard a sound at the end of the hallway. She turned and saw Damien standing in the shadow beyond the light, watching. He hadn't made a sound. He was in a dark t-shirt with his arms at his sides, and he was looking at his daughter, and the expression on his face was not the controlled, steady thing it had been downstairs. It was something else, something he had not intended anyone to see. His eyes moved to Vivian. She didn't say anything, neither did he. She just turned back to Isla and stayed, and he remained where he was in the shadow of the hallway, and the snow went on falling outside. And inside the house, the night was very quiet. When she finally went back to the guest room, a long time later, Vivian stopped in the hallway. Damien was gone. But on the floor in front of the guest room door, precisely placed, was a glass of water and a small plate with 2 crackers on it. And it was the most practical and least sentimental gesture of care she had encountered in years. She picked them up and went back inside. She sat on the edge of the bed and ate the crackers in the dark, and thought about Isla's face and Lucy's hand and Caleb's door, barely cracked. She thought about a man in a dark coat stepping out of a convoy in a blizzard. She thought, I don't know what this is. She thought, I don't know what he is. She thought, I know that I cannot afford to stay here. And she thought, I know that I am going to have trouble leaving. But she didn't know yet, couldn't have known, that trouble leaving was already beside the point. She didn't know yet that somewhere in this house, 3 children were rearranging themselves around her existence the way water rearranges around a new shape. She didn't know that Damien Moretti, who had not been caught off guard by anything in the better part of a decade, had stood in a hallway and watched a stranger be kind to his daughter, and felt something shift in the architecture of himself. She didn't know yet about the people who were already watching this house, who had been watching it for months, who would eventually find a new and useful angle of attack. She didn't know any of it. She just sat in the dark with her crackers and her water and the sound of the snow and the memory of Lucy's voice. She's going to be warm. She was warm. And outside, through the iron gates and the white-covered grounds, beyond the perimeter where men stood in the cold and watched and waited, a figure sat in a parked car with a phone to his ear and said, very quietly, She's inside. Yeah, Moretti's house. A pause. I don't know who she is yet, but I'll find out. The line went dead. The snow kept falling. Well, she was still in the house 3 days later. That had not been the plan. The plan, to the extent that she'd had one, lying in the dark eating crackers on that first night, was to sleep, recover some basic function, and leave in the morning with something resembling dignity. Find a shelter, call Denise, figure out the $43, get out before she became a problem in someone else's life. But morning had come, and Lucy had knocked on the guest room door at 7:15 with a plate of toast and the focused intensity of a child delivering something important. And Vivian had opened the door and looked at that small face and the carefully arranged toast and had said thank you, and Lucy had said you're welcome, and then had simply walked in and sat on the end of the bed and started talking, and by the time Vivian had finished eating, 40 minutes had passed and she was still there. She stayed that day. She told herself it was because of the snow, which was still heavy, which was a reasonable excuse. She stayed the next day because Lucy asked her to help with a school project, and the asking was so direct and uncomplicated that there was no graceful way to say no. She stayed the 3rd day and stopped explaining it to herself. She found her shape in the house the way water finds its level, not by being directed but by following the natural gradient of need. Caleb needed someone to check his history paper at 9 in the evening when Damien was on the phone and Greta had gone to bed. Lucy needed someone to untangle the specific emotional complexity of a disagreement with her best friend that had 17 moving parts and required a patient audience. Isla didn't need anything, and said so clearly, but twice Vivian had been in the kitchen when Isla drifted in, and both times they had ended up talking, not about anything important, never about anything important, until Isla realized what was happening and remembered to be guarded again. Damien she saw in pieces. Morning coffee in the kitchen, brief and quiet. Dinner, where he ate with the children and asked real questions and listened to the answers with his full attention in a way that was striking mostly because it was so uncommon. Occasionally late at night, when she couldn't sleep and neither could he, passing in the hallway or finding each other both standing at the kitchen counter. And those were the conversations she thought about afterward. The ones that didn't start anywhere in particular and didn't end anywhere either, Just two people talking in the specific way that people talk when they're not yet ready to say what they actually mean. She knew things about him in layers. The surface layer was what anyone might notice. The security, the cars, the way his men moved around him with a particular deference that had nothing to do with ordinary employment. The second layer was what the children told her without telling her, that he had certain rules that were not negotiable, that there were rooms she had not been invited into, that his phone sometimes rang after midnight, and he answered it in a voice that was different from his kitchen voice. The third layer was what she began to assemble from the spaces between things. The way conversation stopped when she entered certain rooms, the documents she occasionally glimpsed on his desk before they were turned face down, the scar on his jaw that matched two smaller ones on his left hand. She was not stupid. She had always been good at reading rooms. She read this one carefully and decided, for now, that she did not need to read it all the way to the end. It was on the fourth morning that Damien came into the kitchen while she was helping Lucy practice her multiplication tables and sat down across the table and waited until Lucy had been sent upstairs to get her backpack, and then said, without preamble, "You can stay, if you need to." She looked at him. "I don't want to be a—" "I know you don't." He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "I'm not offering charity. The kids are—" He paused, chose the word carefully. "Better, since you've been here." "I'm a stranger." "You were," he said. "You're less of one now." She sat with that for a moment. "I need to find work. I had a job, administrative coordinator at a nonprofit. I can probably go back. I need to find somewhere to live." "One thing at a time," he said. "That's very easy to say when you live here." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Stay until you have a plan that isn't just leaving for the sake of it." She looked at his hands around the mug. She looked at the kitchen. Lucy's drawings on the refrigerator, Caleb's backpack exploded across one chair, the particular warmth of a room that gets used. She thought about her apartment. She thought about the envelope she'd thrown in the trash. "Okay," she said. Third time. She was getting tired of that word doing all the heavy lifting. The conflict started in the second week. It started the way most real conflicts do. Not with a single dramatic event, but with the accumulation of small frictions that individually mean nothing and collectively mean everything. The first friction was Caleb. He had been thawing, slightly and reluctantly, in the way that 11-year-old boys thaw when they don't want to admit they like someone. He'd started showing her his history papers before handing them in. He'd corrected her twice about Civil War dates with the barely suppressed pride of someone who enjoys knowing things. He'd asked her once, in a voice calibrated to sound completely casual, whether she thought his teacher was right that his writing was too dry. She'd told him his writing wasn't dry, it was precise, and that there was a difference, and that his teacher probably meant he should write more about people instead of just events. He'd gone away and come back 2 days later with a revised paper that was measurably better, and had not thanked her, which she found completely endearing. Then she made the mistake of mentioning, over dinner, that she'd been an English minor. "You should have been an English major," Caleb said immediately. "Probably," she agreed. "Then why weren't you?" "My parents thought it wasn't practical." He frowned. "But it's what you wanted. Sometimes what you want and what you do aren't the same thing." "Why?" he said, with the particular aggression of someone who has not yet made enough compromises to accept that question. "Because other people's opinions have weight when you're young, and you let them." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Did you let them too much?" She looked at him. He was looking back at her with 11-year-old directness, which is the most unsparing kind. "Yeah," she said. "Probably." "That's—" He started and stopped. "Go ahead." "That's kind of a waste," he said, with the bluntness of someone who hasn't yet learned to soften true things. It stung. She let it sting. "Yeah," she said again, "it is." Damien, across the table, was watching this exchange with his face very still, in the way it got when he was paying attention to something he didn't want to appear to be paying attention to. He said nothing. The second friction was larger, and came from the direction she least expected. She had gone to collect her remaining things from the apartment. She hadn't told Marcus she was coming. She had a key still, technically, and the divorce papers were not yet signed, and she needed her books, and her grandmother's things, and the rest of her clothes. She'd taken a cab and arrived mid-afternoon on a Wednesday, assuming he'd be at work. He wasn't at work. He opened the door before she got her key in the lock and stood there in the frame looking at her with an expression that she couldn't immediately read, and then could. And it was worse than she'd expected. It wasn't anger, it was something more complicated. Injured pride mixed with the specific rage of a person who has made a decision they're not sure about and cannot afford to be unsure about. "Where have you been?" he said. "I came to get my things." "Where have you been living, Vivian?" She pushed past him into the apartment. It looked the same. It smelled the same. It was completely foreign to her. "That's not your concern anymore." "It is if you're—" He stopped. She turned and looked at him. He was staring at the sweater she was wearing, which was the one she'd borrowed from the guest room, which was a man's sweater, large and dark. "Whose is that?" "Marcus." "I'm asking a question, and I'm not answering it." She went to the bedroom and got the boxes she'd left and started filling them. He stood in the doorway, watching her with his arms crossed and that injured look sharpening into something else. "People are talking," he said. "Good for people." "Vivian, I'm serious. I'm hearing things about where you're staying, about who—" He stopped, started again. "Damien Moretti is not someone you want to be associated with. Do you understand what that name means? Do you have any idea?" "I know that he pulled me out of a snowstorm," she said without stopping packing. "I know that his children are kind. That's what I know." "His children." The way he said it was a particular kind of contemptuous. "They're not even his." She stopped. She set down the shirt she was folding and turned and looked at him very directly. "Say that again." He had the sense to recognize what he'd walked into, but not the sense to walk back out of it. "I'm just saying, those kids aren't his. He bought them, or collected them, or whatever you want to call it. It's not a real family, Vivian. It's a—" "Stop talking," she said. "I'm trying to help you." "You threw me into a blizzard," she said, and her voice was very quiet, which was the voice she was learning to watch out for in herself. "You called me useless. And now you want to explain to me what a real family is?" The silence that followed was comprehensive. Marcus's jaw tightened. And then, because he was the kind of man who, when losing ground, reaches for the knife. "Sign the papers, Vivian. Whatever this is you're doing, playing house in some criminal's mansion, pretending to be a mother to kids who already lost one. It isn't going to last. And when it falls apart, don't expect me to—" She picked up her boxes and walked out of the room and out of the apartment and down the elevator and out of the building and stood on the sidewalk in the cold and breathed. In, out, in. She did not cry. She was done crying about Marcus. What she felt instead was something cleaner and more useful. A hard, settled clarity. The kind that comes when someone says the thing they should have kept to themselves and accidentally tells you exactly who they are. She knew who he was now. She'd known for a while, probably. But now she knew it in her bones. She went back to Damien's house. She didn't tell Damien about the conversation. But 3 days later, she found out she didn't need to. She came downstairs at 11 at night because she couldn't sleep and found Damien in the study at the end of the hall, the door not fully closed. She was going to pass it. Then she heard the tone of his voice and stopped. I was on the phone. He was standing with his back to the door, one hand on the window frame, and his voice was doing the thing she had started to recognize. Not loud, not threatening by volume, but carrying a particular weight that occupied the room completely. "I know who he is," Damien said. "I know what he's doing. Tell him to stop." A pause. "No, tell him that this is the only time I say it." Another pause, longer. "He's making calls. He's asking questions about my house, my kids, my—" A pause. "People who ask questions about my kids find that they have a great deal less to do with their time. Make sure he understands that." The call ended. Vivian stood in the hallway with her heart beating slightly too fast and thought about what she'd just heard and what it meant, which was several things at once, not all of them comfortable. She pushed the door open. He turned. He looked at her. He was not surprised. She got the sense that very little surprised him, that his awareness of a room extended to the hallway outside it. "You heard that?" he said. "Some of it." He set the phone on the desk. "Your ex-husband has been making inquiries about me, about the household." His voice was neutral, which was its own kind of information. "It's being handled." "What does handled mean?" He looked at her for a moment. "It means he'll stop." "Damien." She said his name and felt the weight of it, still unfamiliar. "I need to know what handled means." "It means he'll be persuaded that this line of inquiry is not in his best interest." He paused. "No one is going to hurt him, Vivian. He's going to make a phone call and then have a very sudden and sincere change of heart about pursuing this further." She wanted to ask how. She looked at his face. the steadiness of it, the complete absence of doubt, and decided that she had already read far enough into that particular layer of the room for tonight. He won't stop, she said. He doesn't lose gracefully. He will this time, Damien said. She looked at him across the study, the desk with its turned-down documents, the window behind him showing the dark grounds and the distant iron gate, the two men visible at the perimeter who were always visible, always patient, always cold. Why? She asked. Not why would Marcus stop. The other why. The bigger one. Damien was quiet for a moment. In the silence she could hear the house, the particular stillness of it at night, the children upstairs, the heat moving through the walls. Because this is my house, he said, and the people in it are mine to protect. He stopped. Something shifted behind his eyes. And you're in it. She held that. She held it very carefully, the way you hold something that might be fragile or might be the opposite, and you aren't sure yet which. I'm not yours, she said. Not unkindly. No, he agreed. Not like that. A pause. Not yet. The words sat between them in the air of the study, and neither of them moved toward it or away from it. And after a moment, Vivian said good night and left, and she did not sleep for a long time. Isla found out about Marcus 2 days later. Vivian didn't know how. In this house, information moved in ways she hadn't fully mapped, but she came down for breakfast and found Isla at the counter with her arms crossed and her jaw set and an expression that said something had shifted overnight. Your ex is trying to get information about this house, Isla said, before Vivian could say good morning. Where did you hear that? I hear things. Isla's eyes were direct and a little angry. Is that why you're here? Because you're hiding from him? No. Are you going to leave when he backs off? Isla, I'm asking a real question. Her voice was flat and hard and trying to be older than it was. Because I've done this before. People show up, they're around for a while, and then they leave. And there's always a reason that sounds real. I just want to know if that's what this is. Vivian looked at her. 15 years old with that mask so firmly in place that you could almost miss what was underneath it. Almost. I don't know what this is, Vivian said, which was the truth. But I'm not leaving because things got difficult. That's not who I am. People always say that. I know they do. Isla looked at her for a long moment. The mask didn't drop, not entirely. But something behind her eyes shifted. A minor and involuntary concession, the kind you can't take back once you've made it. Okay, she said, turned back to her cereal. Done with it, or pretending to be. Vivian went to the coffee maker and poured herself a cup and stood at the counter and thought about how much she meant what she'd just said. Enough. She meant it enough. Which was not the same as all the way, but it was more than she'd meant anything in a long time. Then Caleb came thundering down the stairs with a look on his face that immediately rewired the room. There's a car outside, he said. It's been there since yesterday. I clocked it. Damien was behind him. She hadn't heard him come downstairs. He was already on his phone. Black sedan, east side of the gate, Caleb said. I wrote down the plate number. He held up a piece of paper. 11 years old, composed, precise. Vivian looked at that small piece of paper and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with temperature. Damien took the paper without a word. He looked at it. He said 2 sentences into his phone. He hung up. He looked at Caleb. Good, he said. Just that. But the way he said it, the weight and the directness of it. Caleb stood up slightly straighter. Then Damien looked at Vivian. There's something you should know, he said. She waited. Marcus has been talking to people who are not simply curious. He's made contact with someone who has a particular professional interest in my household, an investigator. He paused. Child Protective Services. The kitchen went very quiet. Lucy, who had appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, looked between the adults with the antenna of a small child tuned to the frequency of adult alarm. What's Child Protective Services? She asked. Caleb answered before anyone else could. His voice was flat and careful. They check on kids, he said, to make sure everything's okay. Lucy processed this. Everything is okay, she said, with complete certainty. Yeah, Caleb said. He looked at Damien. Right? Damien looked at his son, 11 years old, trying so hard to be steady, and said, yes. But the way he said it was not quite the way it should have sounded, and everyone in the room heard the difference. Caleb heard it. Isla, appearing silently in the doorway, heard it. Vivian heard it. She heard it, and she understood, in a fast and cold and very clear moment of reckoning, what was happening. Marcus, who had called her useless, who had thrown her into the cold, who lost things gracefully about as well as a building loses a wall. Marcus had found the angle, had found the one lever that could move a man like Damien Moretti, had aimed it not at Damien, but at the children. And she understood something else, something that she had been circling for 2 weeks without landing on directly. She wasn't just staying here because she had nowhere else to go. She hadn't been, for a while. She looked at Lucy in her pajamas, and Caleb with his straight spine, and Isla with her arms crossed in the doorway, and Damien with his steady hands, and his face that was working to show nothing. And she thought, this is the thing. This is the thing I've been pretending isn't happening. These people, this kitchen, this house. This is it. And Marcus, who understood nothing about her, who had never looked at her the way even an 11-year-old boy looked at her when she told him his writing was precise and not dry, Marcus had found the exact right thing to threaten. She set down her coffee cup. "Tell me what you need," she said to Damien. Her voice was steady. She was a little surprised by that. He looked at her. Really looked at her. The full weight of it. The way he looked at things when he had decided to stop pretending he wasn't looking. "I need this household to be above question," he said. "Every room, every routine, every—" "Then that's what it will be," she said. "Vivian." His voice dropped slightly. "If they come here and they find anything they can use, they won't. You don't know what they're looking for." "I know what they won't find," she said. "They won't find children who aren't loved. They won't find a house that isn't a home. They can look at every room." He was silent. Caleb said quietly from the table, "She's right." Damien looked at his son, then back at Vivian, and the look on his face in that moment, she would carry it for a long time afterward. Not soft, not sentimental. Just the look of a man who has spent years building walls and is encountering, for the first time in longer than he can calculate, something he cannot build a wall around. Outside, past the iron gates, past the perimeter where his men stood in the cold, the black sedan was still there. And somewhere in the city, Marcus Hale was on the phone with someone, saying her name in a voice that meant he was not done. He was not done, but neither was she. The investigator came on a Thursday morning, 9 days after Caleb wrote down the plate number. Her name was Sandra Okafor, and she arrived at 8:45 in a gray sedan that was not the same car that had been parked outside the gate, which meant there were at least 2 people watching now. Vivian saw her from the upstairs hallway window. Medium height, dark coat, a briefcase held with the particular grip of someone who uses it as a prop as much as a tool. She stood at the gate for a moment before buzzing, looking at the property the way people look at things they have already made up their minds about. Vivian went downstairs. Damien was already at the front door. He had his composed face on, the one that showed nothing, gave nothing, asked for nothing. He'd sent the children to school an hour early. The house was very quiet. "I'll be in the kitchen," Vivian said. He looked at her. "You don't have to—" "I know." She went to the kitchen. She heard them in the entrance hall. Introductions. The brief professional exchange of a woman who has done this many times with a man who is not going to make it easy. She heard the deliberate pace of footsteps moving through the house. Okafor doing her assessment, Damien beside her, saying the right things in the right voice. Then they came to the kitchen. Okafor stopped in the doorway. She looked at Vivian with the evaluating neutrality of her profession. Not unfriendly, not friendly, just present, cataloging. "Ms. Hale," she said. Vivian turned from the counter. "Ms. Okafor." She had done her homework. "Coffee?" A slight pause. She hadn't expected the name. "Thank you." Black. They sat at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, and it was the most civil and most dangerous conversation Vivian had sat through in her life. Okafor asked questions that were shaped like ordinary questions, and were not ordinary at all, about the household routine, about the children's schooling, about how Vivian came to be living here, about her relationship to the children, about her background, her employment, her previous address. Vivian answered everything. She answered simply, without ornamentation, without the over-explaining that signals guilt. She watched Okafor's pen move across her notepad and thought about the things she had said to Damien. They won't find children who aren't loved. She held on to that thought like a handhold. "How long have you known Mr. Moretti?" Okafor asked. 3 weeks? "And in 3 weeks you've moved into his home." "I was in an emergency situation," Vivian said. He offered shelter. The arrangement developed from there. Developed how? I help with the children, homework, logistics, the things that are difficult to manage when you're a single parent. Are you being compensated? No. Okafor wrote something. And the children? How would you characterize their emotional state? Stable, Vivian said. Better than stable. They're good kids with a father who is genuinely present. Isla is working through grief in the way teenagers work through grief, which is to say, not always gracefully. Caleb is careful and precise and needs someone to tell him that precision is not the same as being closed off. Lucy is... She stopped. Let herself feel it for half a second. Lucy is extraordinary. Okafor's pen stopped moving. Damien said nothing. But under the table something shifted. She felt rather than saw it, the slight change in the quality of his stillness. Ms. Hale, Okafor said, and her voice changed register slightly. The complaint that initiated this investigation was specific. It alleged instability in this household, inconsistent supervision of the minors, and exposure to individuals and activities that may be harmful. The complaint was filed by my ex-husband, Vivian said, who has a personal interest in causing disruption to this household. That may be true. It doesn't change my obligation to investigate. I'm not asking you not to investigate, Vivian said. I'm asking you to weigh the source. Okafor looked at her for a long moment. The pen was still. I'd like to speak with the children individually, after school. Of course, Damien said. She came back at 4. Vivian picked the children up herself. Damien had suggested it without making it a suggestion, and she understood why. A woman at the school gate looked different than 2 large men in an SUV. She walked Caleb and Lucy back through the front door and sat with them at the kitchen table for 20 minutes before Okafor arrived, just talking, just being present, letting the house be itself. The interviews were in the living room one at a time, with the door open. Vivian stayed in the kitchen and did not listen. She heard Lucy's voice, steady and a little proud, the way Lucy talked about things that mattered to her. She heard Caleb's voice, shorter answers, but answers. She did not hear Isla's voice because Ila came home late, and when she came in through the back door and saw the gray sedan in the driveway, she stopped completely and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Vivian. What's happening? She said. It wasn't a question. Someone from Child Protective Services, Vivian said. She's talking to the others. Isla's face went through several things very quickly. Then it went still in the way it got when she was making a decision. Okay, she said. Set her bag down. I'll talk to her. You don't have to. Yeah, I do. She looked at Vivian. This is because of your ex. Yes. Isla held that for a second. Something moved through her expression that was not quite anger. It was older than anger, more tired. Fine, she said, and went into the living room. Okafor left at 6. She told Damien she'd be in touch within 2 weeks with her assessment. She was professional and neutral all the way to her car, and gave nothing away, which was either good or bad, and there was no way to know which. The house that night was quiet in a different way from its usual quiet. They ate dinner, and nobody talked much, and Lucy, who was normally impossible to shut up, ate most of her food without saying anything, and then asked if she could watch television, which she never asked because she never had to. Vivian did the dishes. Damien stood in the kitchen after the children were upstairs, and she was aware of him behind her, the weight of his presence, and didn't turn around. She was doing her job, Vivian said. I know. The kids were good. They were. A pause. Isla was... He stopped. Something in his voice was off-center in a way that was unusual for him. She turned around then. His face was not composed. Not entirely. There was something in it that she had not seen before. Not fear. He was not a man who did fear easily, but something adjacent. The specific expression of a person who is aware that the thing they have built is vulnerable in a way that their skills cannot fully address, and that the vulnerability is precisely in the thing that matters most. What did she say? Vivian asked. Isla. She told Okafor that this was the first time in 4 years she'd stopped sleeping on the edge of her mattress. He said it flatly, as a fact, which made it worse. She said she used to sleep that way because she wanted to be able to get up fast, in case she needed to leave. Vivian stood very still. She hasn't told me that, he said. In 4 years. The kitchen held that sentence for a moment. She told a stranger, he said. And there was something in how he said it. Not accusatory, not toward Vivian, Just the specific weight of a father realizing there are rooms in his child he hasn't been able to open and that someone else found the door. She told someone who wasn't going to feel guilty about it, Vivian said. Okafor is a stranger. Strangers don't carry it the same way. Isla knew you'd carry it. He looked at her. She was protecting you, Vivian said, the way she thought she was supposed to. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she turned back to the sink because looking at his face in that moment felt like something she hadn't been invited to do. She shouldn't have to protect me, he said. No, Vivian agreed. She shouldn't. The 2 weeks passed in a state of suspended tension, ordinary on the surface, a live wire underneath. Vivian had gone back to her job by the second week, the nonprofit, letting her return without ceremony, and she took the bus each morning and came back each evening, and the rhythm of it felt both strange and steadying, proof that she still had a life outside these walls, that she was here by choice. She told herself that daily. Sometimes she believed it. Marcus had gone quiet, which was worse than when he was loud. The black sedan stopped appearing outside the gate. She knew this meant nothing, knew, from the particular quality of Damien's silence on the subject, that something had happened, that the phone call had been made, that Marcus had been persuaded in whatever way Damien persuaded people. She did not ask. She had decided not to ask about certain things. She was aware this was a compromise she was making, and she made it with her eyes open. On a Tuesday evening in the third week, she was in her room. Her room, she had started thinking of it as hers, reviewing applications for a graduate program in social work that she had not told anyone about yet, when Damien knocked on the open door. She closed the laptop. He came in and sat in the chair by the window, the first time he had done that, come into this room, and looked at her with the directness that she had stopped finding startling and started finding something else she didn't have a word for yet. Tell me something about yourself, he said. Something I don't know. She looked at him. That's a broad category. Narrow it. She thought for a moment. I used to draw, she said. Architectural drawings. Not buildings, interiors. The way spaces work. I stopped in college because someone told me it wasn't serious. The same someone who told you English wasn't practical. She paused. Different someone. Same category of wrong. He was quiet for a moment. Why do you let people tell you what's serious? I stopped, she said. Did you? She looked at him. The window behind him showed the dark grounds, the distant lights of the perimeter. You're not in a position to ask that question, she said. He raised an eyebrow slightly. You run an empire, she said. You wear the coat and the cars and the men at the gate, and that's all real. I'm not naive about what that means. But you won't let your daughter see you not be steady. You won't let anyone in this house see anything except the version of you that has it handled. She paused. That's also people telling you what's serious. The silence was different from their usual silences. It had an edge to it, not hostile but live, the edge of a conversation that has gotten to something real faster than either person planned. That's fair, he said finally. I know. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. You're getting harder to argue with. I was always this hard to argue with. You just didn't know me well enough to notice. He looked at her for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he stood up. The investigator's assessment comes Friday, he said. I have someone looking at the process. It should be fine. It will be fine, she said. He nodded once, went to the door, stopped. Vivian, he said without turning around. The drawings. Don't stop doing things because someone else called them unserious. A pause. That's all. He left. She opened the laptop again, stared at the graduate program application for a long time, then started filling it out. Friday came. The assessment was not fine. Okafor called at 2 in the afternoon. Damien took the call in the study. Vivian was in the kitchen helping Lucy with a school project, a poster about community helpers, Lucy's handwriting large and certain across the poster board, when she heard Damien's voice change through the closed study door. Not loud, not raised, but the quality of it shifted, and she knew, the way you know things you don't want to know, that something had gone wrong. He came to the kitchen doorway 10 minutes later. Lucy looked up, looked at him, went back to her poster with the instinct of a child who has learned when adults need a minute. Step out, he said to Vivian. His voice was level. His face was the composed one. That was how she knew it was serious. The more serious it was, the more composed he became. They stood in the hallway. The assessment flagged the household, he said. Not the children, not the care. The association. My name. My business history. His jaw was tight. They're recommending a formal review, a panel. They want documentation of finances, of the household structure, of my legal standing. They want letters from the children's schools, their doctors. A pause. And they want documentation of your status in this household. She went still. What does that mean? It means Marcus provided them with information suggesting your presence here is, he stopped, chose the word, ambiguous, irregular. He told them you were placed here, that it was a coerced arrangement. The hallway went very quiet. He told them I was placed here, she repeated. Yes. Like I had no... Yes. She put her hand against the wall, not for support, just for something solid. He's telling them I'm not here by choice, that you... She couldn't finish the sentence. That I brought a vulnerable woman into my home under duress, Damien said, and that the welfare of the children is secondary to... His voice stopped. Started again, very controlled. He gave them a specific framing, Vivian, and the investigator has a professional obligation to take it seriously. She thought about Marcus at the apartment door looking at her borrowed sweater. She thought about him on the phone the night she'd heard Damien in the study. She thought about him sitting at the kitchen table with his attorney's envelope and his composed face and his glass of water he'd never drunk. He had not stopped. He had only gotten quieter while he reloaded. What happens if the review goes badly? She asked. Damien looked at her. For a moment the composed face slipped, just slightly, just enough. They can recommend removal, he said, of the children. The word removal landed in the hallway like something dropped from a height. Lucy was in the kitchen 4 feet away, coloring community helpers on a poster board. Caleb would be home from school in an hour. Isla had a track meet and would be back by 5. They can take them, Vivian said. Not a question. It would require a court order. It would be contested. I have lawyers. He said it like a man who is aware that lawyers are not enough, and is saying the word anyway because it is the thing he has. But if the review panel... How long? She interrupted. How long until the review? 3 weeks. She stood in the hallway and thought about 3 weeks and what they had, and what Marcus had done, and what it would cost to fight it, and what it would cost not to. Tell me everything they need, she said. Vivian, all of it. Every document, every letter, every piece of paper they want. Tell me. She looked at him directly. And tell me what Marcus gave them. Exactly what he said. Damien looked at her for a long moment. Then he told her. He told her about the statements Marcus had made to Okafor in a follow-up call. That Vivian was emotionally unstable following a medical diagnosis. That she had no stable housing, no financial independence, no social network. That she had entered the household in a state of crisis and had been absorbed into it in a way that was not... This was the word Marcus had used. And it was a careful word, a lawyer's word, not voluntary in any meaningful sense. She listened. She stood in the hallway with her hand on the wall, and she listened to every word, and she did not let her face do what it wanted to do. He used the diagnosis, she said when Damien finished. Yes. He told them I found out I can't have biological children and that I'm... Her voice held. He told them that's why I'm here, that I'm using your children to fill something. Yes. She looked at the wall. She looked at the particular texture of the plaster, and she thought about what it meant to have the most private thing, the thing she had not even fully processed herself, the thing she had cried about once in a borrowed shower and then put away. She thought about what it meant to have that thing handed to strangers by the person who was supposed to have been her partner. He's not wrong that I can't have children, she said. Her voice was very even. He's wrong about everything else. I know that. The panel won't. Not yet, Damien said, but they will. She turned and looked at him. His face was still composed, still controlled, but his hands, she had started reading his hands over the past 3 weeks, the way they moved or didn't move. His hands were not entirely still. Damien. She said his name the way she had in the study, the night of the phone call, with weight. Is there anything in this house that they can use? Anything real? Not Marcus's version? Anything that actually gives them cause? He held her gaze. A long moment. My past is not clean, he said. I know that. There are aspects of my business history that are... I know that too. Then you know that if they go deep enough? Is there anything that touches the children? She said. Directly. Anything that has ever come close to them? His answer was immediate. No. Then we fight it, she said. It's not that simple. I know it's not simple. I didn't say simple. I said we fight it. She looked at him. Those kids are not going anywhere. Lucy is not going to wake up one morning and find out the family she finally has is gone because my ex-husband decided to burn everything on his way out. Something broke in Damien's composure. Not completely. Not the whole thing. But a crack. Visible. Real. I've kept them safe for 4 years, he said, and the rawness in it was unexpected and complete. Every threat, every risk, I managed all of it. And now some man in an apartment uptown is going to... He stopped. His jaw was tight enough that the scar on it went white. I don't lose things, Vivian. I don't. But I don't know how to fight this kind of thing. Courts and panels and documented instability. That's not my... He stopped again. I know, she said quietly. I don't know how to fix this. She had never heard him say, I don't know. She had never expected to. It was the most unguarded sentence she had heard from him since the night in the hallway outside Isla's door, when she had seen his face do something he hadn't chosen. You don't have to fix it alone, she said. He looked at her. That's the point, she said. That's the thing Marcus doesn't understand. He thinks I'm here because I have nowhere else to go. He thinks I'm a variable you can use against the household. She held Damien's gaze. But I'm not a variable. I'm someone who is choosing to be here. And if you'll let me help, I will take apart every single thing Marcus has built, and I will hand this panel a household so clearly, undeniably real that there will be nothing left to question. The hallway held that. From the kitchen came the sound of Lucy humming to herself, the quiet scratch of a marker across poster board, a child making something out of nothing with complete and unselfconscious confidence. Damien looked at Vivian for a long time, long enough that she felt it in her chest, not uncomfortably, but with the particular weight of being looked at by someone who is deciding whether to trust something they have not trusted in a long time. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. His face changed. I have to take this, he said. Go. He went back to the study. The door closed. She stood in the hallway alone for a moment. Then she heard his voice through the door. Not the words, just the tone. And it was not the kitchen voice or the hallway voice. It was the other voice, the one from the night of the first phone call, flat and heavy and completely cold. She went back to the kitchen, sat across from Lucy, picked up a marker. What do community helpers do? Lucy asked, without looking up from her poster. They take care of people, Vivian said. Even when it's hard? Especially then. Lucy considered this. Are you a community helper? Vivian looked at the child's face, the dark eyes, the total absence of strategy, the uncomplicated directness of someone who asks what she means and means what she asks. I'm trying to be, she said. Lucy handed her a blue marker. You can color this one, she said, pointing to a figure on the poster. That's the lady who helps families. Vivian took the marker, and in the study Damien's voice dropped so low she couldn't hear it at all, and she understood that whatever was happening in that room was a different category of problem than anything they had discussed in the hallway, and that it was moving toward them whether they were ready or not. She colored the figure carefully, neatly, inside all the lines. Outside it had started to snow again. The phone call in the study lasted 11 minutes. Vivian knew because she watched the clock on the kitchen microwave while she colored Lucy's community helper figure, tracking the minutes. The way you track the sound of weather, not wanting to predict it, unable not to. When Damien came out, Lucy was showing Vivian a correction she wanted to make to the poster's border, and Vivian looked up and read his face in the half-second before he arranged it and understood that whatever had been on that phone was not the CPS review, was not Marcus, was not anything they had already been managing. It was something new. Lucy, he said, take your poster upstairs and finish it in your room. Lucy looked at him. She was 6 years old, and she was not stupid. Is everything okay? Everything's fine. Upstairs. She gathered her markers with the resigned efficiency of a child who has been dismissed before and knows arguing has a cost. At the kitchen doorway, she stopped and looked back at Vivian with an expression that was half question and half something older, something she'd learned from watching adults manage their faces. I'll come check on it later, Vivian said. Lucy went upstairs. Damien sat down across the table. He put both hands flat on the surface in front of him, which she had come to recognize as the thing he did when he was managing something from the inside. Marcus went to someone else, he said. What does that mean? It means he found someone in my business circle who has reason to want leverage over me. Someone who was willing to use what Marcus gave them. His jaw was tight. There's going to be a story, a journalist. Marcus gave an interview, documented, recorded, alleging that this household is a front, that the children are... He stopped. She waited. That the children are here as a cover, he said, for the appearance of legitimacy. The kitchen was completely silent. He said that, she said, flatly. Not a question. It goes to print in 48 hours unless I give this journalist something better. Something better. An interview. Access. A cooperative source who makes the story about Moretti the reformed family man instead of Moretti the criminal using children as camouflage. He said it without inflection, which was worse than anger. If it prints the way Marcus told it, the review panel gets a copy on their desks before our hearing. The hearing is in 6 days. 6 days. The hearing that would determine whether 3 children stayed in their home. She looked at his hands flat on the table. She thought about what 48 hours meant and what 6 days meant, and what a story like that would do. Not to Damien. He had survived stories before. His name had been in print in ways that would have broken other men. But to the children. To Isla, who had started sleeping in the center of her mattress. To Caleb, who had handed a piece of paper with a license plate number to his father because he was 11 years old and he was trying to hold things together. To Lucy, who had handed a stranger a mug of hot chocolate and a small mittened hand and had never once questioned whether that was safe. What does the journalist want? She asked. Access to the household, the children on record, which I will never allow, and a primary source. He looked at her. They want you. She went still. Marcus told them you were the angle, Damien said. Vulnerable woman, no resources, ends up in the house of a man with my reputation. He framed it as, the muscle in his jaw moved, predatory. She thought about Marcus at the apartment door. She thought about the word useless delivered conversationally. She thought about the attorney's envelope on the kitchen table. He had spent their entire marriage making her smaller, and he was still doing it from across the city, still finding ways to make her into a version of herself that needed rescuing or managing or explaining, still refusing to allow her the dignity of her own choices. What happens if I talk to them? She said. You change the story. If you go on record, your words, your account, your version of how you came to be here. Marcus's framing collapses. He's a jealous ex-husband with an agenda. The story becomes something the panel can dismiss as a personal vendetta. He paused. But you'd be on record. Your name, your medical history, if Marcus gave it to them, which I believe he did. Everything. He gave them the diagnosis. Almost certainly. She sat with that for a moment. The particular quality of having the most private architecture of your grief exposed to strangers and made into a narrative someone else controls. I'll talk to them, she said. Vivian, I'll do it tomorrow. She looked at him. Set it up. He studied her face for a long moment. You understand what that means. Once it's in print, I understand. Your name connected to mine, publicly, permanently. I understand, she said again. He looked at her with those dark eyes that were not in the habit of pretending they didn't see things. Why? She looked back at him steadily. You know why. He was quiet. Set it up, she said. Caleb came home at 4 and Isla at 5:15, still in her track clothes with her hair escaping its braid. Vivian made dinner and did not tell them what was happening. She watched them at the table. Caleb arguing with Isla about something she couldn't follow, Lucy periodically inserting herself into the argument with no knowledge of its content but strong opinions, Damien eating with his eyes moving between his children in the particular way he had of paying attention that looked like not paying attention. And she thought about 48 hours and 6 days, and she ate her food and answered when spoken to and kept her face where it needed to be. After dinner, Isla found her in the kitchen. Something happened, Isla said. Not a question. We're handling it. Is it Marcus? Vivian dried her hands on the dish towel and turned around. Isla was leaning against the counter in her track clothes, arms crossed, watching her with those careful eyes that didn't miss things. We have a plan, Vivian said. I need you to trust that. I don't do trust easily. I know, I'm asking anyway. Isla looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen was warm and the house was quiet above them, and from somewhere upstairs Lucy was singing something tuneless and contented. Are you going to still be here? Isla said. After. Yes. Even if it gets bad. Especially then. Isla uncrossed her arms. It was a small movement, barely visible, But it was the most unguarded thing Vivian had seen her do that wasn't at midnight on the floor of her bedroom, and it cost her something, the doing of it. Okay, she said, and left the kitchen. The journalist's name was Kevin Pratt, and he arrived at a coffee shop on the west side the next morning at 9. Vivian arrived at 5 past, late enough to be in control of the entrance, early enough that he hadn't gotten comfortable. Damien's lawyer, a precise woman named Carol Stein, was already there and stood when Vivian came in. Pratt was younger than she expected. Mid-30s, lean, with the alert, exhausted look of someone who runs on information and insufficient sleep. He had a recorder on the table already, red light on, and a notepad beside it, and he looked at Vivian the way she had expected, assessing, recalibrating, adjusting the story he'd already half written to accommodate the woman who had actually shown up. She sat down. She did not shake his hand. "Mr. Pratt," she said, "I want to be very clear about something before we start. My ex-husband gave you a story that is convenient for him. I'm here to give you the true one. Those are different things, and when you print this, you will need to decide which one you're in the business of telling." Pratt looked at her, then at Carol Stein, then back at her. "Ms. Hale," he said, "why don't you tell me how you met Damien Moretti?" She told him, all of it, the doctor's office, the bus shelter, the cold that had started to feel like sleep. She told him about Lucy's hand and Caleb's license plate and Isla on the floor of her bedroom. She told him about the borrowed clothes and the crackers outside the door, and the hot chocolate made with real powder. She told it without sentiment, without ornamentation, exactly the way it happened. Pratt's pen moved. The recorder's red light blinked. "Your ex-husband alleges," Pratt said carefully, "that your presence in the household is, and I'm quoting his language, not fully voluntary." "My ex-husband," she said, "threw me into a blizzard the night I found out I couldn't have biological children. He had already contacted a lawyer before I got home from the hospital. He told me I was useless." She looked at Pratt directly. "He is not an authority on what I choose to do with my life." Pratt wrote something. He also provided documentation suggesting Mr. Moretti's business activities. "I'm not here to discuss Damien Moretti's business," she said. "I'm here to discuss 3 children who have a father who shows up for them every single day, and a home that is as real as any home I have ever seen. If your story says otherwise, you should be prepared to defend that to people who have been inside that house, because I'll make sure they're available." Pratt sat back slightly. He was recalculating. She could see it, the story reshaping itself in real time. The angle Marcus had sold him becoming more complicated, more contestable, less clean. "Ms. Hale," he said, "are you in a relationship with Damien Moretti?" "No." "Are you in love with him?" She looked at Pratt for a long moment. She thought about the crackers outside her door. She thought about the hallway voice dropping low enough that she couldn't hear it. She thought about his hands flat on the kitchen table. "That's not your story," she said. "Print what matters." Carol Stein put her hand briefly on Vivian's arm. "Good, steady, done." Vivian stood up, nodded at Pratt, and left. Outside on the sidewalk. The cold hit her face, and she stood for a moment with her eyes closed and breathed. In, out. Her phone buzzed. "Damien." She answered. "How did it go?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said, "but he's going to have to rewrite it." A pause. "You all right?" "Ask me in 6 days." The story ran the next morning. Not the story Marcus had sold, a different one. Vivian Hale, 30 years old, administrative coordinator, former wife of Marcus Hale, speaks about the night she nearly died in a snowstorm and the family she found on the other side of it. Moretti's name was present but not central. The children were not named. The headline was not what Marcus had wanted. She read it at the kitchen table while the children ate breakfast and did not say anything until Caleb looked up from his cereal and said, "You're in the news." "I know." "Are you okay?" She looked at him, 11 years old, jaw set, trying to be steady. She thought, "This child has been trying to be steady since before I got here, and it is the most exhausting thing I have ever watched." "Yeah," she said, "I'm okay." Caleb held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then he went back to his cereal. Marcus called at 8:45. She let it go to voicemail. He called again at 9. She listened to the voicemail in the hallway, his voice tight and controlled and underneath the control, something she hadn't heard from him before, which was panic. She deleted it. The hearing was in 4 days, and then 3, and then 2. On the night before the hearing, Damien found her in the guest room at 11. She had the graduate program application open again. She had submitted it 2 days ago, but kept opening it, some habit of checking a thing she'd already done. He stood in the doorway. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." He came in and sat in the chair by the window, the way he had before. Outside the grounds were dark and cold, and the iron gate was visible at the far edge of the light. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he started. "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "Don't do the thing where you prepare me for the bad version," she said. "I've been prepared for the bad version my whole life. I'm done with that." He was quiet for a moment. "I was going to say, whatever happens tomorrow, you should know that these 3 months—" He stopped. Started differently. "I don't bring people into my house. I don't do that. Ever." "I know. So you should understand what it means that you're here." She looked at him across the room. The window behind him, the dark grounds, the gate. His hands in his lap, not quite still. "I know what it means," she said quietly. "Do you?" She held his gaze. "Yes." The room held that for a moment. Then he stood up. "Sleep," he said. "I need you sharp tomorrow." "I'm always sharp." "I know." And again, just barely, that thing at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was something. "That's why I need you there." He left. She closed the laptop and lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about tomorrow and the panel and the documents and everything. Carol Stein had prepared and everything that could still go wrong, and she thought about Isla sleeping in the center of her mattress, and she thought about Lucy's hand in the bus shelter, and she thought about Damien's hands flat on the kitchen table saying, "I don't know how to fight this." She slept. She woke at 5:15 to the sound of her phone, an unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. The voice on the other end was male, careful, with the professional neutrality of someone reading from a script they've memorized. He identified himself as an associate of the panel's administrative office. He said there had been a development. He said the panel had received new documentation overnight. She sat up. "What documentation?" A pause. "Mrs. Hale, I'm not authorized to discuss the contents. I'm calling to inform you that the hearing has been moved up. It's this morning, 7:30. That's 2 hours from now." "Yes." "What new documentation?" Another pause. Longer. "The submission was made by a Mr. Marcus Hale," the man said. "It includes financial records, communications, and a sworn affidavit." She was already out of bed, already moving to the door. "What kind of financial records?" "Ms. Hale, I'm not—" "What kind?" The pause on the other end of the line told her everything before the words did. "Records suggesting," the man said, with the slow precision of someone who has been told to say exactly this and nothing more, "that your presence in the household is compensated, that you are, in effect, employed by Mr. Moretti in an undisclosed personal capacity." The hallway was dark. The house was asleep. Somewhere above her, 3 children were still in their beds. She stood in the hallway with the phone at her ear and understood what Marcus had done. He had found bank records, or fabricated them. She didn't know yet, couldn't know yet. Her mind was moving too fast for that distinction. He had found or created documentation that made her look like a hired arrangement, that turned every choice she had made in 3 months into a transaction, that stripped her presence in this house of every bit of its realness, and replaced it with something that looked, on paper, like something else entirely. He had not just attacked Damien. He had attacked her. He had taken the thing she had built, slowly, carefully, against every reason not to, and he had tried to make it look like something purchased. She knocked on Damien's door. He opened it in 10 seconds, fully awake, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. He read her face before she said a word. "What happened?" he said. She told him. His face did not move. Not one muscle, not one degree of change, and that was how she knew, finally, the full depth of what Marcus had done. Because Damien Moretti, who had stood in a blizzard without flinching, who had taken every phone call in that flat and dangerous voice without flinching, went absolutely and completely still. "The affidavit," he said. "Does it name—" "I don't know the contents, but Damien—" She stopped. Something had occurred to her, something cold and fast. "The bank records. If they're fabricated, Carol can challenge them. But if there's anything in your actual accounts that could be misread—" "There isn't," he said. Then 1 beat later, "There shouldn't be." She looked at him. He met her eyes. And for the first time since the snowstorm, since the bus shelter, since the first night and all the nights after, For the first time, she saw something in his face that was not control or composure or the specific deliberate steadiness he maintained like a structure. She saw doubt, not about her, about something else, something in his own house, his own accounts, his own history, something that he was turning over in his mind in real time and not liking what he found. Damien, she said. His jaw was tight. The scar on it was white. Damien, what is it? He looked at her for a long moment. The hallway was dark. The house was sleeping. In 2 hours, they would be standing in front of a panel that had received overnight documentation from a man who had spent 3 months turning their lives into ammunition. There are accounts, he said very quietly. From before the children, He stopped. They're clean now. Everything I've done for the past 5 years is clean, but before, how far before? 6 years. Are they findable? He looked at her, and she understood from his face, from the particular quality of that look, that yes, they were findable, that Marcus, or whoever Marcus had hired, had found them, that the thing Damien had spent 5 years building a wall around was now in a folder on a panel administrator's desk. Downstairs, a door opened. They both turned. Isla stood at the bottom of the stairs in the dark, in her pajamas, looking up at them. She had the face she got when she already knew something was wrong and was deciding whether to pretend she didn't. She looked at Damien, then at Vivian. Tell me the truth, she said. Are they going to take us? The hallway was very quiet. Damien opened his mouth, and Vivian said, before the composure could reassemble itself into something protective and managed and slightly less than honest, not if I can help it. Isla looked at her. Get dressed, Vivian said, both of you. She turned back to Damien, whose face was doing something she had not seen it do before, cracking, slightly, at the edges, in the way that things crack when they have been holding for a very long time. Call Carol, she said. Right now. Tell her everything. Every account, every record, every piece of your history that could be in that folder. She held his gaze. All of it, Damien. No more walls, not today. He looked at her for one long, unguarded moment. Then he picked up his phone. Carol Stein arrived at 6:45 in a black car with 2 associates and a leather bag that she set on Damien's kitchen table and opened without ceremony. She was 51 years old and had the face of someone who had been in rooms like this before. Not this kitchen specifically, but rooms where the floor had dropped out overnight and someone needed to figure out what was underneath before 7:30. She did not waste time on reassurance. She pulled out a tablet and looked at Damien and said, Tell me everything. Start with the oldest account and work forward. Don't editorialize, just facts. Damien told her. Vivian sat at the far end of the table and listened to things she had not heard before. Not the shape of them, she had understood the shape, but the specific weight. Accounts and names that weren't his opened between 7 and 9 years ago, when the organization he ran was something different from what it was now, when the money that moved through it was not the kind that has clean documentation. He spoke without inflection, without apology, with the particular flatness of someone who has made peace with what they were, and is now only interested in what it costs. Carol typed. Her associates typed. Nobody looked at Vivian. At 6:58, Carol said, These accounts, are they dormant? For 5 years, Damien said. Any activity in the last 3 years? No. The funds in them? Declared? A pause. Partially. Carol looked at him over the tablet. How partial? He told her the number. It was not a small number. Carol's expression did not change. She typed. The documentation Marcus submitted. It's unverified. He's a private individual with no subpoena power. Whatever he gave them, he obtained through channels that may themselves be challengeable. She looked up. Which means if his source is dirty, his documentation is inadmissible in a formal proceeding. The panel is a welfare review, not a court. Their standards are different, but their charter requires them to weigh source credibility. She looked between Damien and Vivian. Who did Marcus use to get these records? I don't know yet, Damien said. I have a guess, Vivian said. They both looked at her. He called me useless, she said, the night he gave me the divorce papers. He said it the way people say things they've been thinking for a long time, not the way people say things that just occurred to them. Marcus has been building something for a while. He doesn't do things quickly. He plans. Which means he had someone looking into this household before I even ended up here. She paused. Before the appointment. Before he handed me the papers. The kitchen was quiet. I was already moving, she said. I was just the occasion. Damien looked at her with his face very still. You think he had someone inside my operation? I think he found someone who already had access and was willing to sell it. She looked at Carol. Which means whatever those records are, they came through someone with legitimate access to them. Which means, which means we can find who it was, Carol said. She was already typing. And if we can demonstrate that the source of Marcus's documentation had a financial relationship with him, the panel has grounds to disqualify the submission entirely. She looked at Damien. How fast can you get me a list of anyone with access to those accounts in the last 18 months? An hour, Damien said. You have 40 minutes. He left the kitchen. Vivian stayed. She helped Lucy get dressed. Lucy asked no questions, which meant she understood more than she was showing, which was its own kind of heartbreak. And she made sure Caleb ate something, and she stood in the hallway outside Isla's room for a moment, listening, and heard nothing, and knocked. Come in, Isla said. She was dressed already, sitting on her bed with her jacket on, like she'd been ready for an hour. She looked at Vivian when she came in and said, How bad is it? We have a lawyer and we have 40 minutes and we have the truth, Vivian said. That's more than nothing. Is it enough? Vivian sat on the edge of the bed. I don't know, she said, because Isla was 15 and she was done with the version of care that required lying to people for their own comfort. But I know that every single thing Marcus has put in that folder is being challenged right now. And I know that the only true thing in that building today is what happens in this house every day. And true things are harder to argue with than people think. Isla looked at her hands. What if they don't care about true? Then we appeal. And we keep appealing. And we don't stop. She paused. Nobody in this house is going anywhere. That's not a maybe. Isla looked up. Her eyes were dry, which was the version of Isla that had cost her the most to build. You really mean that? Yes, a beat. Then Isla said very quietly, She would have liked you, my mom. She said it fast, like something that had been waiting a long time and came out before the door could close. She liked people who said real things. She didn't have much patience for the other kind. Vivian sat with that for a moment, with the weight of it and the gift of it, and what it had cost Isla to hand it to her. I would have liked her too, she said. Isla nodded once, stood up, straightened her jacket with the deliberate composure of someone who has decided to be steady. Let's go, she said. The panel convened in a municipal building on the east side. 4 floors up, a conference room with a long table and fluorescent lights and 6 people seated on one side of it. 3 panel members, 2 administrative staff, a court-appointed advocate for the children named Gerald Park, who had kind eyes and a bad haircut, and who had spoken briefly with each child the week before. Damien sat on the respondent's side with Carol Stein on his left and Vivian on his right, which had not been planned, and which Carol had not objected to when it happened. The children were not present. They were in a waiting room 2 floors down with one of Damien's people, and a woman from Carol's office who had brought snacks and a deck of cards, and the specific energy of someone paid to make waiting rooms feel ordinary. Marcus was not present in the room. His documentation was, it sat in a folder in front of the panel chair, a woman named Dr. Renata Voss, who had the careful posture of someone who understands that what she does in rooms like this has consequences that outlast the meeting. The hearing opened. Dr. Voss reviewed the submission structure. One of the panel members, a man named Whitfield with reading glasses on a chain, summarized the allegations: household instability, undisclosed financial arrangements, association with activities potentially harmful to minors. Carol Stein responded with the precision of a woman who had spent 40 minutes turning 40 minutes of information into something airtight. She challenged the sourcing of the financial documentation. Damien's team had moved fast, and what they had found in 40 minutes was not everything, but it was enough. A transfer, 18 months ago, from an account connected to Marcus's business network, to an individual who had briefly worked as a contract accountant for one of Damien's legitimate subsidiaries. The chain was not clean, but it was visible, enough to argue, enough to put a question mark over Marcus's documentation that the panel would have to address. Dr. Voss listened. She asked questions that were careful and specific. She was not warm and she was not cold. She was thorough, which was the quality that mattered. Then she looked at Vivian. Ms. Hale, she said, you are not a party to this proceeding in a formal sense. You've asked to speak as a witness to the household's character. Yes, Vivian said. I'll remind you that this is a formal review. What you say here is on record. I understand. Dr. Voss nodded. Tell me about the children, so Vivian told her. She did not tell it the way she had told it to Pratt, the journalist. Not with strategy, not with an eye on the angle. She told it the way it was, scene by scene, the way it had actually happened. Lucy with the toast at 7:15. Caleb and his Civil War logistics and the word precise. Ela on the floor of her bedroom on the anniversary of her mother's death. She told it without embellishment and without softening, and she kept her voice level through most of it, and less level through some of it, and she didn't apologize for either. When she finished, the room was quiet. Gerald Park, the children's advocate, was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. He had his pen in his hand and he hadn't written anything in several minutes. Miss Hale, he said, I want to ask you something directly. Okay. The allegation, the specific language from the submitted affidavit, suggests your presence in this household fills a personal need, that you are there because of your own circumstances rather than for the children's benefit. He paused. How do you respond to that? She looked at him. She thought about the answer she could give, the defensible one, the strategic one, the one that addressed the allegation on its own terms. She gave a different one. Both things can be true, she said. The room was very still. I came to that house in the worst night of my life, she said. I had lost something I can't recover, and I had nowhere to go. Both of those things are true, and they're also irrelevant to what happened after I got there. She looked at Dr. Voss. Every person who shows up for a child shows up from somewhere. They show up from their own history, their own need, their own reasons. That's not a disqualification. That's just being human. She paused. What matters is what you do when you're there. And what I did when I was there was show up, every day, for all three of them. And I will keep doing that whether or not this panel approves of how I arrived. Dr. Voss held her gaze for a long moment. Then she looked at the documents in front of her and made a note and said, Thank you, Ms. Hale. The panel deliberated for 2 hours and 17 minutes. Vivian sat in the hallway outside the conference room with Damien and Carol and did not speak much. At some point, a cup of coffee appeared in her hands. She didn't know who had put it there. It was bad coffee, municipal building coffee, and she drank all of it. Damien sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose and looked at the floor with the expression of a man who has run out of things he can do and is encountering the full discomfort of that. You did everything right, she said quietly. He looked at her sideways. I did everything I could. That's not the same thing. No, she agreed, but it's what you had. I was quiet for a moment. The accounts. The old ones. He said it to the floor. I've spent 5 years trying to make sure that wasn't the thing that defined everything. That the kids never had to... He stopped. It wasn't the thing that defined everything, she said. They have it in a folder. Folders don't define things, she said. What you do after defines things. 5 years of doing it differently. That's in a folder too. It just doesn't look as dramatic. He looked at her, fully, the whole weight of it. How are you this steady right now? I'm not, she said. I just look it. Something moved in his face that she had only seen a handful of times, and that cost him something each time. Vivian. Don't, she said, the same way she'd said it the night before, but differently this time. Not a deflection, more like a request. Not yet. Let this resolve first. Let us be on the other side of this before you say the thing. Understood. He looked back at the floor. They waited. At 12:43, the conference room door opened and Carol was called back in. Vivian and Damien stayed in the hallway. Damien stood up. He walked to the window at the end of the hall. It looked out over the street, gray and cold, ordinary city going about its ordinary morning, and stood there with his back to the hall and his hands in his coat pockets. Vivian watched him. She thought about the first time she'd seen him from behind, through smudged plexiglass, stepping out of a convoy in a blizzard, walking toward a bus shelter without hesitation. She thought about how she had watched that and felt, first, embarrassment about being found like that, and how much had changed since then, how thoroughly that instinct had been replaced by something else she didn't have a single clean word for. Carol came back out at 12:51. Her face was controlled in the way that lawyers' faces are controlled, which meant nothing. She walked toward them and stopped and said, The panel has concluded its review. Damien turned from the window. The submitted documentation was flagged for source integrity concerns and given reduced evidentiary weight, Carol said. The panel's assessment, based on household observation, witness testimony, and the Children's Advocate's report, finds no substantive grounds for removal or modified custody arrangement. She paused. The case is closed. No further review is scheduled unless new credible evidence is presented. The hallway was very quiet. Damien said nothing. His jaw moved once. Then he looked at the ceiling for a moment, not dramatically, just briefly, the way people look at ceilings when they are managing something they have not had practice managing. Vivian sat down on the hallway bench and put her face in her hands for a moment and breathed. Just breathed. In, out, in. When she looked up, Damien was looking at her. He had come away from the window and was standing in front of her, and his face was the most open she had ever seen it, all the careful architecture of it temporarily suspended, and she understood that this was what he looked like when he wasn't managing anything, when he was just a man who had been very afraid and was no longer afraid and was letting that be visible. She stood up. She didn't plan what happened next. She put her hand on his face, her palm against his jaw, against the scar. And he went very still, and she said very quietly, "Go get your kids." He put his hand over hers for one moment, held it there. Then he went down the stairs. She stood in the hallway with Carol and listened to the sound of his footsteps. And then, from 2 floors down, the sound of a small girl's voice going from ordinary to ecstatic in the space of a single syllable. And she stood there and let that sound work its way through her until she felt it in her hands. Carol put a hand briefly on her shoulder, said nothing, then went to pack her bag. The ride home was loud in the way that relief is loud. Not celebratory exactly, because they were all too tired for celebration, but released, the specific noise of people who have been holding something very heavy and have just been told they can set it down. Lucy talked without stopping for most of the ride, which was the sound of Lucy returning to herself. Caleb sat beside Vivian and was quiet, but let his shoulder rest against hers, which was his version of the same thing. Isla sat in the back with her head against the window and did not talk, but at one point caught Vivian's eye in the reflection of the glass and held it for a long moment, and what passed between them did not need a word. Marcus called that afternoon, Vivian answered. She had thought about this moment. She had imagined it going several ways, with anger, with the cold dignity of someone who has won, with nothing at all. What she actually felt, sitting in the kitchen of Damien's house with the afternoon light coming through the window and Lucy's poster now hanging on the refrigerator, was very little. Not forgiveness. She was not in the business of cheap forgiveness, the kind that costs nothing and changes nothing. Not contempt either. Something quieter and less satisfying than either. The particular feeling of looking at someone and finding that they have less power over you than you once thought, and that this has been true for a while, and that the process of understanding it was the whole thing. "It's over, Marcus," she said. "Vivian, you can talk to Carol Stein's office about the documentation you fabricated. That's a separate conversation and it's not one I'm part of." She paused. "Don't call me again." She ended the call. She sat for a moment in the kitchen quiet. Then she opened her laptop and found the email she had not yet opened. It had come 2 days ago, in the middle of everything, and she had seen the sender and closed the tab because there had been no room for it. Columbia School of Social Work. The subject line, your application, spring cohort. She opened it now. She read it twice. Then she sat very still with the laptop open and the afternoon light on her hands and felt something move through her that she had not felt in a long time. Not relief, not exactly, and not joy, not exactly, but the specific sensation of a door opening in a direction you had stopped believing existed. She had a full scholarship. She started in September. She was still sitting there when Damien came into the kitchen. He looked at her face and stopped. "What is it?" he said. She turned the laptop around. He read it. He looked up. "Columbia," he said. "Yes." "Social work." "Yes." She looked at him. "Helping children, adoptive families, kids who—" She stopped, tried again. "Kids who need someone to fight for them the way someone should have been fighting for them all along." He looked at her for a long moment. "You've been working on this." "For a while." "You didn't tell me." "I wasn't sure it was real yet," she said. "I didn't want to—" She paused. "I didn't want to say it out loud before I knew." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He put his hands on the table. Not flat this time, not the managing gesture, just his hands. "I'm not going to ask you to stay," he said. "Columbia is—" It's in the city, she said. It's 20 minutes from here. He looked at her. I'm not leaving, she said, if you don't want me to. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, from somewhere in the house, came the sound of Lucy talking to Caleb and Caleb telling her she was wrong about something, and Lucy absolutely refusing to accept that. I don't want you to, Damien said. Then I won't. He looked at his hands on the table, then at her. Vivian, I need to say something and I need you to let me say it without stopping me. She waited. I have done things, he said, in my life. Things that are in folders and things that are not in folders. Things I made peace with a long time ago and things I'm still working on. I am not a simple thing to be connected to. I know what my name costs people and I have never asked anyone to pay that. He stopped. Started again. But you are the first person in a very long time who has been in my house and seen all of it. Not the managed version, not the composed version, and not left. And I don't know what to do with that except tell you that it matters. You matter. Not to the household, not to the kids, though you matter to them more than I think you know. He paused. To me. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the afternoon light, with Lucy's poster on the refrigerator, and the sound of the children in the other room, and the feeling of a door that had opened in a direction she'd stopped believing in. I know, she said. That's all I... He stopped. That's what I needed to say. I know, she said again. I've known for a while. He looked at her. That unguarded look, the one without the architecture. What do we do with that? He said. We do this, she said, what we've been doing, and we see what it becomes. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he nodded, once, the way he nodded when something had been settled. Not a small nod, a real one. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Just that. Just her hand over his on the kitchen table with the afternoon light on both of them, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a moment in the particular quiet of a house that has been through something and is still standing. Lucy burst into the kitchen at full speed and stopped dead when she saw them. She looked at their hands. She looked at Vivian's face. She looked at Damien's face. Are you guys? She started, with enormous and barely contained significance. Go finish your homework, Damien said. I finished it. Find more homework. Lucy stood her ground for 3 full seconds, which was impressive. Then she retreated to the doorway, where she stopped and said, with the dignity of someone who has made an important discovery, I'm just saying I told Caleb this was going to happen, and disappeared. Vivian laughed. It came out of her before she could shape it or manage it, just a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere below the sternum. And she looked at Damien, and he was almost smiling, that thing at the corner of his mouth that had been growing more visible over the past 3 months. And she thought that she would spend a long time trying to get him all the way to a real smile, and that this was not a problem. The months that followed were not simple. She had not expected them to be. The graduate program was hard in the way that things are hard when they matter. Long hours and difficult coursework and cases that came home with her in the space behind her eyes, even when she was physically elsewhere. She was good at it, which she had suspected and which it turned out was different from knowing. She was good at sitting in a room with a child who had learned to expect abandonment and making them feel, without saying it directly, that she was going to be there next week. She was good at reading the specific language of people who have been hurt in quiet ways that don't leave visible marks. She knew that language. She had been learning it for 30 years. Damien kept his word, gradually, carefully, in the way that a man dismantles something he built over a long time and is not entirely sure of the structural consequences. The organization moved further into legitimacy with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. There were setbacks. There were nights when his phone rang in that voice, and she heard it through the wall and understood that the distance between what he had been and what he was becoming was not a line, but a long road with bad weather on it. And she decided each time, deliberately, to still be there in the morning. She decided it every day. That was the whole thing, she came to understand. Not a single decision made once, but the same decision remade daily, which was harder and also more real. The children grew in the ways that children grow when they finally have room to. Caleb turned 12 and then 13 and wrote a history paper that his teacher submitted to a regional competition, and that won, and he told Vivian about it with the elaborately casual manner of someone who is very pleased and working very hard not to show it. And she told him his writing was precise, not dry, and he said he knew, he'd always known, and she said, "Of course you did." Isla got a track scholarship offer from a state university at 16. She sat at the kitchen table and read the letter 3 times before she let herself react. And when she reacted, it was not the teenage explosion of feeling, but something quieter and more complete. She put the letter down and looked at Vivian and said, "She would have wanted to see this." And Vivian said, "She knows," which was the closest either of them ever came to the subject of what Iela believed or didn't believe about where her mother was, and it was enough. Lucy turned 7 and was exactly the same person she had been at 6, only more so, which was both exhausting and exactly right. The year Vivian finished her degree, they had a dinner at the house. Not a party, she didn't want a party, just the family and Carol Stein, who had become something adjacent to a friend, and Greta, who had been managing this house for longer than any of them, and Damien's 2 oldest associates who had been there the night of the snowstorm, and who had spent the subsequent year recalibrating their understanding of their employer. After dinner, Damien took her out onto the terrace. It was a clear night, cold but not vicious, the kind of cold that feels honest rather than hostile. The city was visible in all directions, lights against dark, the specific beauty of a place that doesn't stop for anything. He had something in his hand. She looked at it. It was small and simple, and she understood immediately what it was, and felt the understanding move through her, not as shock, but as arrival. The sensation of reaching a place you have been walking toward for long enough that you had started to forget you were still moving. "I'm not doing this with a speech," he said. "Good," she said. "I hate speeches." "I know you do." He looked at her, the unguarded look, the one that had been getting easier to find, the architecture becoming more permeable, the walls not gone, but lower, lower. "I know you don't need this. I know you would be fine without it. I know you have a career and a degree, and 3 kids who would follow you anywhere, even without the paperwork." He stopped. "I'm not asking because you need it. I'm asking because I do." She looked at him for a long moment. The city behind him. The cold. The specific weight of his face in the dark being completely honest. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger. It fit. She looked down at it for a moment, then she put her hand on his face. The same hand, the same jaw, the scar under her palm. And he leaned into it slightly, barely perceptibly, the way someone leans into warmth when they have been cold long enough. "Damien," she said. "Yeah. Go tell the kids." He almost smiled, the whole way this time. "They already know," he said. "Of course they do." From inside the house came the sound of Lucy's voice rising in volume, and then Caleb's voice, and then the specific crash of what was probably someone knocking something over in excitement. And Damien looked at the door, and then at Vivian, and she looked back at him. And neither of them moved for one more moment, just stood on the terrace with the city around them and the cold and the light from inside falling through the glass. She thought about a bus shelter. She thought about smudged plexiglass, and the sound of engines in a storm, and a small mittened hand finding hers in the dark. She thought about the word impossible, which had been given to her as an ending and had turned out to be something else entirely. She thought the family she had spent her life expecting wasn't waiting to be born. It was waiting to be chosen. And she had chosen it. Badly, with no information, in borrowed clothes in a stranger's kitchen, 1 cup of real hot chocolate at a time. She had chosen it every day since. That was the whole thing. She turned from the city and went inside, back to the warmth and the noise, and the particular beautiful chaos of a home that knows what it is. And the door closed behind her, and the night went on, and the city below them never stopped moving, indifferent and alive and full of people out in the cold who had not yet found what she had found. And she held that thought gently, like a responsibility, like a compass, like the kind of thing you carry forward when you've been lucky enough to find your way in from the dark. Outside the iron gate, the street was quiet. The shelter at Holland and 7th had a fresh coat of municipal paint. The snow, when it came again that winter, fell the same way it always did, sideways, mean, without apology. But inside the house, the lights were on. They were always on now.